The Texas sun bore down on the vast plains, turning the dirt beneath it into a cracked, hardened crust. Hank, a weathered man shaped by years of ranching in harsh conditions, stood silently, watching over what little remained of his cattle. His ranch, known only as the Bar H, wasn't much more than a symbol of his sheer will to endure. Not prosperity. Solitude had become his shadow, always present, quietly weighing on him in ways that no labor could ease. He kept to himself, rarely traveling into town, preferring the comfort of his land over the shallow company of passing strangers and terse shopkeepers. But with winter closing in and his stores nearly gone, he had no choice. The trip to Willow Creek trading post stretched on, the wheels of his wagon groaning and the wind whispering relentlessly across the open land. When he finally arrived, the place buzzed with the scent of sweat, dust, and livestock. Horses snorted, men barked out deals, and the air trembled with noise and motion. He was heading toward the general store when a ruckus drew his eye. A crowd had gathered near a rough, sloppily made pen more mud than wood where a woman stood among pigs, her clothing torn, her skin smeared with dirt, her shoulders slumped like something had finally given way inside her. She was being auctioned off, paraded before a laughing, leering crowd like some beast of burden. It was a twisted spectacle in a place where women were few and their worth too often diminished. Revulsion welled up inside Hank, cold and sharp. This wasn't what he'd come for. He wasn't here for a woman, and certainly not in this way. All he wanted were provisions to get through the next few months. But just as he turned to walk away, her eyes locked with his. Even through the grime and sorrow, there was something unbroken in her stare, a hint of pride, of fire not yet extinguished. In that instant, surrounded by jeers and animal grunts, something inside him stirred, not pity, not lust, recognition. He didn't see a slave or a prize. He saw a person, and without thinking, without weighing consequences, his voice rose above the noise. How much for her? The crowd stilled, heads turned. The silent rancher had spoken. The deal was done quickly, money handed over, and just like that, a life was changed. He had no answers, no grand intentions, just a sense that leaving her there would be wrong. She followed him to the wagon in silence. Between them stretched a chasm filled with uncertainty and unasked questions. The ride home was long and hushed. Clara, he had overheard the name, sat rigid in the wagon bed, her face turned away from him, eyes locked on the horizon. Hank wanted to speak, to offer something comfort, maybe, but he had no words. What could he possibly say to a woman he'd just bought? His thoughts churned, a muddle of guilt, confusion, and a fragile resolve to treat her with the dignity she'd been denied. When they finally reached the Bar H, the sun was sinking low. Clara looked around at the worn cabin, the sagging barn, the endless plains swallowing them whole. It wasn't much, but it was safe, and it was hers now. As much as it was his. There was something unfiltered and real about it all. Hank, careful not to come off as intimidating, kept his voice low and movement slow. He helped her down from the wagon, eyes averted. "You can stay in the spare room," he muttered, gesturing toward the small side room off the cabin. "It's not much, but it's yours." Clara gave a small nod, her voice barely audible. "Thank you." In the days that followed, a quiet pattern began to form. They rarely spoke, but something wordless passed between them, an agreement, an understanding. Clara didn't wait to be told what to do. She tidied the little cabin, made simple meals, and brought the overgrown garden back to life. Hank carried on with his grueling work around the ranch. They communicated in glances, in subtle movements, and in the kind of silence that started to feel companionable. He noticed how she patched his old shirts with neat, careful stitches, how she hummed softly as she kneaded dough, how the tension in her shoulders gradually eased with time. He began to see not just a woman surviving, but one full of quiet endurance. One evening, a dust storm barreled across the plains. Wind shrieked through the cracks in the walls, and the windows rattled with each gust. Inside, the lantern flickered uncertainly. Hank sat at the table cleaning his rifle. Clara, seated near the hearth, was sewing a tattered quilt. Suddenly, the wind slammed against the door with a loud crash. Hank saw her flinch, something flash in her eyes, a memory, maybe, of another storm from another life. Wordlessly, He stood, pulled a heavy chair over, and braced the door shut. He looked back at her. She met his eyes, and in that moment, no words were needed. He was saying, "You're safe." That night, something subtle shifted. The distance between them, once vast and unmapped, began to shrink just a little. To solitary souls, huddled against the same storm dot as spring crept in, so did change. Rain came gently at first, then steadily, softening the hardened earth. The world began to green again, and with that quiet rebirth, something new began to bloom between Hank and Clara. Their conversations started slowly talking about the weather, the cattle, chores. Clara's presence on the ranch became indispensable. She had a natural way with animals, a gentleness that even Hank respected. He watched her repair fencing with swift, nimble fingers, surprised by how capable she was. Then came another storm, darker and faster than expected. The sky bruised purple, thunder cracked overhead, and lightning seared the sky. While repairing a section of fence, Hank slipped, his ankle twisting sharply beneath him. He went down hard, pain flaring bright through his leg. Clara didn't hesitate. She wrapped her arm around his waist and helped him hobble back through the rain. Though small, she bore his weight without faltering. Back inside, soaked and muddy, she gently cleaned the wound and wrapped his ankle with practiced hands. Hank lay back, watching her in silence. He wasn't used to relying on anyone. Yet here she was, not because she had to, but because she chose to. "Thank you, Clara," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. It didn't feel like enough. She looked up, meeting his gaze. There was no pity in her eyes, just a steady, quiet understanding. In that storm, with his pride laid low and his strength compromised, another kind of bond began to take root. They were no longer just a man and a woman bound by circumstance. They were starting to become something more, a pair of survivors building something together. The ache of Hank's solitude began to ease, bit by bit, replaced by something warmer, something shared. A fragile peace settled over the land and in his heart. But peace is rarely left unchallenged. One day, a figure appeared at the edge of the ranch, a man with hard eyes and a mean sneer. He rode up, dismounted slowly, and announced himself with a presence that made the air feel tight. Silus. He claimed Clara belonged to him, that she was paying off a debt, and he'd come to collect. The wind shifted, the tension returned, and just like that, the fragile world they'd begun to build stood at risk of being torn apart. Clara flinched as soon as she laid eyes on him. The color drained from her face, and the fear she had buried deep within surged back to the surface. Hank caught the look in her eyes and felt something stir within him, an instinctive rage, born not just of anger, but of fierce protectiveness. He stepped forward, positioning himself squarely between her and Silas. "She's not leaving with you," he said, his tone calm but resolute, his voice edged with steel. Silas gave a low, mocking laugh, one that seemed to echo with menace. "You got yourself a handful, old man. She's mine." The air grew thick with tension, though Hank was still favoring his healing ankle. He held his ground with the quiet confidence of someone who understood both the terrain and the type of man he was facing. He didn't reach for his weapon right away. He didn't need to. His presence, his stance, the unwavering look in his eyes all made one thing clear. Clara was under his protection now. Clara watched the scene unfold, something shifting inside her. She no longer saw Hank as the man who had claimed her at the post, but as the one standing between her and her past, shielding her. Words flew, barbed, bitter threats that escalated quickly. Hank moved with calm precision, lifting his rifle from its place. He didn't point it, but held it with practiced ease, making his intentions unmistakable. "Get off my land," he growled, "and don't come back." Silas studied him for a long moment, weighing his odds. Whatever he saw in Hank's eyes made him pause, with a final scowl and a muttered threat. He turned and rode off. Swallowed by the settling dust of the trail, Clara collapsed to the ground, her body shaking. Hank was beside her in an instant, kneeling, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "You all right?" he asked, voice low and filled with concern. She looked up at him, tears streaking her cheeks. But her expression had changed. There was relief, yes, but also something deeper. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice barely audible. "I did." Hank answered without hesitation, his eyes locked on hers. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them, an understanding, a bond no words could fully capture. Hank hadn't stepped in out of obligation or ownership. He had done it because he cared, because she mattered to him. From that day on, everything shifted. The weeks that followed were quiet, almost peaceful. Silas never returned, and with time, the threat of him faded like the tracks left in dust. What remained was the slow unfolding of daily life, a rhythm that grew more familiar. With each passing day, Hank's ankle healed, and he and Clara began working side by side. There was a new ease between them. Conversations flowed freely, their movements in sync. She spoke of her past, of the hardships that had carved her into the strong woman she was. And Hank opened up too, about the years of solitude, the ache of loneliness, and a hope he hadn't realized still lived in him until she walked into his life. The cabin, once stark and silent, changed. Clara brought life into it. Flowers in old tins, a quilt draped over the bed, the smell of bread baking in the oven. Hank found himself looking forward to coming home, not just to the warmth of the hearth, but to her. One evening, as the sun set the sky ablaze with orange and violet, they sat together on the porch, a comfortable silence between them. Hank turned to her, his chest tight with emotion. "Clara," he began, his voice rough, "when I took you from that place, I didn't know what I was doing, just knew it wasn't right. But since you've been here, this place, it's alive again. So am I." He paused, drawing a breath. "This ain't the way most folks do it, I know. But would you marry me? Not because I bought you, but because I want you as my partner, my wife, someone to build a life with." She held his gaze, the fading sunlight dancing in her eyes. There were no dramatic words, no theatrics, just honesty. She saw in him everything she'd come to believe was lost: respect, care, and a quiet love that had taken root and grown strong. A smile spread slowly across her face, soft and real. "Yes, Hank," she said, "I will." They married not long after, in a modest ceremony performed by a preacher passing through. A few ranch hands stood witness, and beyond them, the silent stretch of plains. Their life together wasn't easy. Life out west never was, but they faced it side by side. Two souls who had found one another through hardship, not convenience. They didn't just survive, they built something lasting. A home shaped not by walls or land, but by trust, mutual respect, and a love that had risen from dust and despair. Hank, once alone in his quiet world, had found not just a companion, but a reason to keep going. In Clara's eyes, he saw not just hope but home.